wandering through our understanding of dinosaurs. This is mostly focusing on dinosaurs, but this is probably small d dinosaur here. How we've come to understand them. So it starts off with fossils. And fossils, ancient Greeks have descriptions in some of their writings that have survived that talk about big bones. So we've been picking up fossils forever and pondering over them. But for a long time, what to make of them was not clear. People didn't understand that Earth had a deep history, and they didn't understand why a piece of rock would look like a bone or a tooth. When these bones were found, they were assumed to be the bones of giants, and in medieval Europe, at least, that was a popular conception. They have one of the earliest known dinosaur fossils that was scientifically described was described by this fellow here, by Robert Plot, in the 1600s. He wrote an essay on the natural history of his part of England, and just general natural history, everything that crossed his desk, but probably his study. And in there, it's just natural history object he found. He drew and figured this creature here, or this piece of a creature. There's a fossil there. I didn't know what to make of it, but there it is. Was it a giant? It looks like a bone, and it looks like part of a leg or an arm bone, right? People knew enough anatomy to get that far as a vertebrate bone. Was it a giant? Some people thought it was an ancient Roman war elephant, and all sorts of ideas kicked around on what this was. Unfortunately, it's lost. We don't know. It got lost somewhere in the 1800s, so we can't examine it today. It eventually got described scientifically as for the genus and species name by someone named Robert Brooks. They called the scrotum humanum.
Oh my!
It looks like a huge scrotum, and that's how it comes down to us. But unfortunately, we don't have the fossil anymore. If it exists, it's not known where. Well, here's what it turns out. It almost certainly is the distal end of the femur. And we now have dinosaurs from Britain that we can match, at least with the drawing. And there's a dinosaur called Megalosaurus, which we'll get to in a minute. And this is thought to be the first dinosaur bone given a scientific name. And it appears now to have been part of a megalosaur. That's Megalosaurus, known from very incomplete fossils still to this day. But we think it's a tyrannosaur-like thing and distal end of the femur. That's the starting point. Fossils for a long time are called formed stones. That's the word that people threw around. They didn't really associate them with ancient life. It looked like a whatever, but that doesn't mean it was, a plant or a skull or whatever, because it was made of stone. We couldn't figure that out. So what do we make of these stones that look like these? These are shark teeth. And medieval people used to collect them, and they called them devil's teeth. They thought they were part of, some ancient demon. That looks like a sand dollar, but it's made of stone. So people collected these. They wrote books about them. What were they? Well, scientist by the name of Cuvier was not the first to join them with ancient living things, but he's an important figure here. Cuvier was a zoologist we call him a zoologist today, I don't know if they had a word back then, in Paris, early 1800s, late 1700s. He was brilliant, and he did all sorts of things. His big deal, though, was comparative anatomy, comparative vertebrate anatomy. You showed him a vertebrate bone, he could tell you what animal it came from, tell you what the bone was. Oh yeah, that's from a mole. It uses that to burrow with. He knew vertebrates backwards and forwards, and this is his actual part of his collection, which still exists. Well, last time I was in Paris, it was still there. They were talking about tearing it down, which is so cool. It's 2 floors of hundreds and hundreds of articulated skeletons from the 1800s. It's just really a neat display. Someone brought him these fossil bones at some point in his career, and he immediately recognized them as elephant teeth. Elephants have very distinctive teeth, and there was no question that's what those were. The problem was they were dug up in Paris at a gravel pit outside the city, and there are no elephants in Paris, and there never had been in anyone's memory, and they were deep down, so it's like a circus elephant or something. How'd they get there? Well, they eventually found the whole skeleton, jaws and all, and he compared the bones that were dug up in Paris to African elephants, which are alive today, and Indian elephants, which are alive today. And it's a third type of elephant that no one had seen before. And he brought this together. elephant of a type that's no longer with us. So he was opening up the door to the fact that the Earth had a deep past, and at a time when people really assumed it didn't. And it gives us two very important concepts there. Deep past, our planet has history, and things go extinct. He was one of the first people to talk about extinction as a fact. This elephant is no longer with us. It's extinct. And that was a new idea. It was a dangerous idea to some people. What did he have? He had a mammoth. You guys have been to La Brea tar pits? I think it's such a cool thing. You've seen the woolly mammoths down at the La Brea tar pits? Well, they had them in Europe too. That's what he had. He didn't know that's what he had, but that's what he had. So he was able to establish this concept that the Earth had a deep history and that these were fossils that could help us explore it. And so we remember Cuvier for that. So while we're on mammoths, I just have a complete random aside here. This is an island north of Siberia. And there were mammoths on that island, woolly mammoths on that island. There's one of its tusks. That's not a fossil, that's a tusk. These animals, this is the last population of mammoths to go extinct, and these mammoths, the last one died when these were being built. That's just 4,000 years ago. That was their last holdout. I don't know why I think that's so interesting, but I do. You think of mammoths with cavemen, not ancient Egyptians. So anyway, the Earth has history. What was it like? We're starting to get clues there. People were very confused because a lot of people at least in Europe, had a very rigid concept of human history, and it was based on the book of Genesis. Garden of Eden that was created over 6 days, and a little while later there's a flood that erased everything, and we've been going on since then. So what were these creatures that aren't with us today? Were they monsters in the Garden of Eden? Were they monsters before the Garden of Eden? What was going on here? So as we find these things, try to take the clues and make sense of them. Here's a few people that help flesh out the story. This is the Reverend William Buckland, who was an important theologian and cleric in the Church of England in the 1800s. You can see his time and date there. And as many clerics in his tradition in Britain of his day, many clerics would have a side hobby. And it would be usually natural history, often natural history or science. Someone would translate ancient documents. Some of them would study nature. And some of their nature writing is actually still read today. It's quite poetic. Charles Darwin's tradition. Charles Darwin started in the seminary school learning to be a pastor in the Church of England, transferred into science. Buckland studied fossils in several different places. And one place they had a cave called Kirkdale Cave, and in it was an enormous accumulation of very jumbled up fossils of animals that don't longer occur in England, hyenas and lions and things like that. And they excavated this and brought them out and tried to understand that. We don't have hyenas and lions in Britain today. Why am I seeing all these fossils there? It's thought that it was a cave, there was a big flood, and a whole bunch of animals were drowned, and their bodies were deposited. The fossils are in a huge jumble at the bottom of this cave, and that's thought to be what happened there. But it's making us think about creation, as we call it, having a deep and mysterious past. Buckland gives us the first scientific description of a dinosaur, Megalosaurus, which I introduced you to a minute ago. This lower jaw was discovered in the 1820s, and it was given to him, and he drew it and gave it a scientific name. He called it Megalosaurus, which means big lizard, because it's clearly a reptile jaw with reptile teeth. He didn't know what the hell to do with it. They call it Megalosaurus. It had no connection with dinosaurs, but there it is. And that's our first dinosaur with a proper description. Megalosaurus. And that's what they thought it looked like. Big, lumbering lizard, kind of like a bear. That's a 1850s outdoor sculpture of it. It still exists. Mantell is another Englishman. Mantell was a physician. And this is another tradition in Europe at the time. Physicians dabbled in science. You didn't go to graduate school and study science. You went to graduate school and studied medicine. and then maybe became a scientist. And he was actually we'd call it then obstetrician, baby birther. And he was so skilled at baby birthing that he was very busy at it, because if you had a difficult pregnancy, this is the guy you wanted. And he was traveling all over his area delivering babies. I think that's kind of an exciting issue of his life. You know those awesome British names, Gideon Algernon. So he would go to quarries where they were carving out lithograph stone or other kind of stone, and he would buy the fossils as they were found from the quarrymen. And he published books on fossils. He and his wife did this. 1820s. So it's beginning to be acceptable to think, okay, there's ancient stuff that we can study here. And these are pictures from his fossil books. He was just interested in ancient things. And there's a flowering of interest in this, and I think it's really well demonstrated by one fact. He published one book, and then word got out he was working on a second book, and he got a letter from King George IV. Wrote to Mantell and said, His Majesty is pleased to command that his name should be placed at the head of the subscription for 4 copies when your new book comes out. He wants the first 4. That had to have been a big deal. That's the only picture I could find of his wife. She later left him. But he was doing something, probably birthing a baby somewhere, and she was wandering around outside. And in the road, she picked up these in the gravel road. And they're reptile teeth. Teeth are really hard. Teeth fossilize really well and preserve really well. And so these were given the name eventually iguanodon. Iguana tooth. Iguana's in a lizard, don is tooth. They're shaped like the teeth of iguanas, except they're this big. So this is a dinosaur now. And there's another dinosaur that gets a name. And eventually they found more of that skeleton. They found some leg bones, funny little pointy thing, some vertebrae, and some teeth. And that was Mantell's reconstruction. He took an iguana and scaled it up and put a point on its nose like a rhinoceros. And that's our first full-fledged dinosaur. And there it is right there with a little sting on its nose there. That's an 1850s concrete model of what they thought these things looked like. He gets another creature, 1820s still. This is 30 years before Darwin published his work. Gets another fossil chunk there. There's his drawing of it. Ancient creature, trying to figure out what it was. And he named it Hylaeosaurus. I'm not sure what Hylea means. Saurus means lizard. And now we have 3 dinosaurs. These large ancient creatures. Megalosaurus, Iguanodon, Hylaeosaurus. Here's what we think they look like today, by the way. There's that ancient 1800s view of them. Here's our modern perceptions of them. And we still don't have the word dinosaur yet, by the way. Let's take a trip to the sea. On the south coast of England, there's a resort town called Lyme Regis. And today, people go down there to sit on the beach, get some sun, swim in the ocean. And in the 1800s, people did the same thing. People with money would travel down here to take the sea air, as they said. It was healthy. And they would take a little beach vacation if they had the money to do it. And that's what it looked like. They would actually, you couldn't swim in the ocean because people might see you in a swimming suit. Even the modest swimming suits, these funny little things were towed out into the water, and that was your changing room. And you would sit on the steps where no one could see you. And then you'd get back in, they'd tow you back. That was Victorian modesty, or pre-Victorian. Anyway, at this town, there's these cliffs. They're early Jurassic, about 200 million years old. These ocean cliffs here. This is an ancient ocean bottom from the Jurassic, called the Blue Lice Formation. And it's famous for fossils today and back then. The enormous abundance of marine fossils are found there. ammonites. This is an ammonite, which is like a chambered nautilus, like that squid that lives in a shell. Really, really common. Vertebrate fossils are occasionally found there, and vertebrates always are more interesting to us than invertebrates. And there's an ichthyosaur, like a dolphin-like Mesozoic reptile. So Mary Anning lived in that town. She had a fairly short, hard life. There she is with her geology hammer. She was not a scientist. She was an entrepreneur. And she would go out to these cliffs after storms and look at the stuff that had eroded out, and she'd collect these fossils, and she'd sell them to people. And she had a little table in front of the house in downtown of the town, and people would buy them as souvenirs. And when she found cool stuff like this in the 1820s and 30s and 40s, this really piqued the interest of the people who were studying ancient life, because that's an animal we can recognize now. And so she discovered a plesiosaur, an aquatic Mesozoic reptile, full skeleton, near full skeleton. And she discovered an ichthyosaur. That's actually her ichthyosaur right there. This dolphin-like Mesozoic reptile. And that you can go to the Naturalist Museum in London today and see her specimen there. It's kind of cool. And so she would sell these. The better ones, the dinosaur people that were starting to study dinosaurs, would give her money for these, good money. I don't know what good money was, £5 maybe. But they would, say, next time you get one, send me the letter first so I can come down and grab it before my competitor does. And she became quite well known in those circles. She was not a scientist, but a really skilled fossil collector. And I can tell she's got a resurgence, and she disappeared for 100 years and she wasn't well known. Some books have been written about her, and she's kind of being pushed back into prominence where she deserves to be. People like this, and there's a bunch of them, I'm just going to get one or two more. Hawkins was one of these guys who was fascinated by what we call dinosaurs today. He would buy these skeletons from her. He was more of a collector than a scientist, and he was always scamming somebody. He bought these, and he bought them from her, and then he sold them to the British Museum for far more than they should have been worth, and a huge investigation. His reputation was sullied, but everyone's trying to make a buck on somebody. But he would do these drawings as trying to interpret the fossils and what we were looking at today. So, we're finding these things. Let's take stock. We're finding these things. People are taking interest in them. And what was going on? They're like dragons, right? Was this happening before the Garden of Eden? Was it before the flood? And people are trying to contextualize it with meshing it with the Book of Genesis account. And by the 1850s, again, this is still before Darwin. I mean, Darwin's working, but he hasn't published his work yet. These things were brought to the public light, and there's something called the Crystal Palace exhibition. It's like a World's Fair. And in a park in London, they made this huge steel and glass pavilion. It's not there anymore. And the grounds around it, they put these big concrete models of dinosaurs. Those are still there. There they are. And people, the point I want to make here is people are fascinated by these. They walk around and just marvel at them like you'd marvel at them today, except they had no broader context to understand them than you do today. And so those are those big three dinosaurs: Megalosaurus, Iguanodon, Hyposaurus. And I found this cool picture of them being built. And even though we're enjoying them, we still don't have the word dinosaurs yet. We don't have the concept of dinosaur yet. You can see these. My times in London, I don't know why I didn't wander over there to see them, but they're still there. Okay. Here's Sir Richard Owen. He's an important player. Sir Richard Owen was another anatomist. That was the big science of the day. He was a guy who understood anatomy backwards and forwards. He was brilliant. Comparative anatomy. Like Cuvier, you could show him a bone, he'd say, well, that's the shoulder bone from a hyena. And it's used for this. And so these dinosaur bones were things that were put in front of him. And so he was the person to try to interpret them. Just a few things about Owen. Here's what Darwin said about him. No fact tells so strongly against Owen as that he never reared one pupil or follower. He was not a nice man, apparently. I did. I think I took it out. I found an adorable picture of him with his daughter on his lap. So maybe his daughter liked it. He was a friend of Darwin's until Darwin published his book on natural selection. And at that point, Darwin and Owen parted ways. Owen never was comfortable with evolution or natural selection and was a major opponent of it, as Darwin and his colleagues were promoting that worldview. Antediluvian, that means before the flood. Before the flood. And the flood we're talking about Noah's flood, the book of Genesis flood. And one interpretation of these creatures was that they were around before the flood, and the flood erased them. That's the framework people had to try to understand them, and that was Owen's framework. We're dealing with a pre-flood animal that's just not with us anymore. But he described them because they're biologically important. Wherever they came from, they're worth describing. Here's a paper that Owen wrote on fossil dinosaurs. These pre-flood dinosaurs, British fossil reptiles. And it's got descriptions like a scientific paper today, but here's the important thing. Right there. Dinosaurians. He gives us that word in 1842. And here's the derivation of it. Saurus means lizard. We've run into that before. And dinos, terrible, powerful, wondrous. We used to talk about terrible lizard because they're scary, right? But he was really apparently going for wondrous. These are wonderful creatures, not terrible creatures. And terrible, another root for terrible is terrific, right? Terrific lizards. That's not quite the same as terrible. But he was probably going for something like that. At least that's the thing. And now we have dinosaur finally. And there's the big three. So, we got people in Europe studying these things. We got cool stuff happening in North America by the late 1800s, 1872. This is a Yale University dinosaur expedition, 1870s. Look how cool those guys look flaunting their firearms. So, North America, let's come over here. Another physician, by the way, another doctor. And he makes America's first dinosaur discovery. Named Joseph Leidy. I think he was in New Jersey, if I remember correctly. And these are finds that came back from Montana. And they're teeth again, mostly. Teeth are really hard. They fossilize melt. So they sent these teeth back, and he described them. Didn't know what the rest of the animal was, but we've got some North American dinosaurs now. These cool names. Horridus. Dinodon. Horrible, terrible tooth, horrible. Trachodon, I'm not sure what that means, but mirabilis, remarkable. Here's a find from New Jersey in another gravel pit. This is the most complete dinosaur skeleton discovered to date, by the way. Hadrosaurus is the name he gave it. And this is it today. And a little piece of the skull and some limbs. It's pretty nice to get that much at that point. But that's the most complete dinosaur skeleton anywhere to date. So now in North America, we get to play with dinosaurs. It's out in the American West, though, where big discoveries are about to be made. You can read a book on this, or it shows up on the History Station, or there's a PBS show called The Bone Wars. And in the 1870s and 80s and into the 90s, these big discoveries were being made out west, and there were competing scientists going at them. And that's why it's called The Bone Wars. We get Omphal Charles Marsh. He was at Yale Peabody Museum, paleontologist. An old school gentleman, very formal, stuffed shirt kind of guy, probably. Well, that's how he's come down to us. And he was brilliant. And these specimens that were coming from Yale expeditions would come back to him to study. And then there was Edward Drinker Cope. and his middle name is Drinker, and that's probably a family name, but he was everything Marsh wasn't. He was a drunk, and a philanderer, and a braggart, and brilliant. And he was in Philadelphia, and he was wealthy too. Had his own money. And so these two people fought over these discoveries. They would send their teams out west, and when a site would be found, and they were paying railroad workers, other people to identify these sites for them. When sites were found, they would try to be the first group in to get the bones, and the bones were packed up and sent back either to Philadelphia or sent back to Yale. Where's Yale? Connecticut somewhere, New Jersey, I can't remember. And they rushed to publish their finds so quickly that some of their papers have really stupid errors in them because they want to be the first get the first reports out. That's how it was done. They would find the bones, they would chip them out, they would wrap them in plaster of Paris like you do today, and they would transport them back to the museum. And they would end up at the museum in big wooden boxes like this. They, go back here. They were so competitive. They both died penniless and miserable. But they were so competitive, and I don't know which one was this. The stories come down to, you could only work in the summer and fall and spring, and when winter came around, you just couldn't work out there. Everything was covered with snow. And at one of the quarry sites where they were excavating dinosaur bones, the season came to them. They had to leave because it was, the snows were coming. And so either Marsh or Cope, I can't remember which one, ordered the people to dynamite all the fossils they could get out of the ground. They destroyed them rather than leaving there with a chance that the other one might pick them up. Doesn't speak highly of the ethics of either of them. So they would come back like this, and I put this picture in because I spent some time at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh, and they have a huge vertebrate paleontology department. We're used to it, smaller now. And this is one of the places Andrew Carnegie paid for some of this stuff, and so some of the bones came to Pittsburgh. And the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, the basement where vert paleos, this happens to be Smithsonian, I couldn't find a picture of the Carnegie, I didn't take one, I should have. But it's got a stone floor, stone paving, stones on the floor, and there's little railroad tracks in it because they would push these big boxes around on little trolleys, and that's all still there. And the boxes are still there. As you walk down this hallway, there's dozens of these boxes. They look like this. And I talked to the vert paleo guy. I said, what are these? And he said, oh, those are bones that came back from the Dinosaur National Monument in the 1880s. And I said, you haven't opened them yet? He said, well, no, kind of know what's in them. I thought, that's like a treasure. Like that last scene in Indiana Jones movie. Well, anyway. So this was North America. And Marsh gives us Stegosaurus. He gives us these classic Jurassic dinosaurs from the American West, like Stegosaurus. And this day, there's the Yale Peabody Museum. This is one of the places you go to see dinosaurs. So there they are. Like I said, they both died miserable and penniless, but made significant and important contributions to the science. But there's a Sesame Street lesson in there, right? Cooperation is better than nasty competition. Early 1900s, late 1800s. Dinosaurs are part of our consciousness. These skeletons are coming back from the American West. And Charles Robert Knight's worth mentioning. He was not a scientist. Knight's the artist of these murals and paintings you see of the classic views of dinosaurs. Charles Knight, that's his interpretation of ancient dinosaurs. And it's a late 1800s, early 20th century interpretation of dinosaurs, which is the dinosaurs of my childhood, by the way. All the children's books I had were illustrated by Knight paintings like this. Guy, I asked you a minute ago, have you been to La Brea Tar Pits? That big mural in La Brea, that's a Knight, that's Charles Knight. So he interpreted dinosaurs, and as was the style of the day, as these big lumbering, dumb lizards that walked around dragging their tails, and slow-witted, dim creatures. And some of them were so big they had to stay in water the whole time. That was an idea Cope had. But this is that old-fashioned idea of dinosaurs dragging their tails like a lizard does today, and kind of slow, dim-witted. Although these are allosaurs, this is kind of cool. No, it's Dilophosaurus. He also interpreted some as agile, active creatures, which is a much more modern conception of dinosaurs. Osborne. We're getting in this. These are Americans. Osborne was at the American Museum in New York, and this is his dinosaur collection. I worked in fish collections where these shells are covered with jars of preserved fishes, like we did in lab that way. Imagine curating a collection where you need forklifts to move the specimens around. So, evolution, our conception of dinosaurs. This is our first view. That's Owens and Hawkins, that artist I showed you earlier, dragging their tail, dumb creatures. Knight, Cope, and Osborne modernized that view a little bit. They're a little bit more anatomically realistic, but they're walking around dragging their tails. And this is dinosaurs into the 70s. This is our conception of dinosaurs. Any good dinosaur movie shows them dragging their tails. And I often think of it, this big, long, heavy tail on this tyrannosaur. A functional anatomist would have looked at that and said, that's not going to work. You have this big tail dragging around. How are you going to make that work with legs arranged like that? That's just not functional in a design perspective. But for most of the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, this was the idea. And we had old school paleontologists looking at this. New discoveries were not being made for a while. And, old guys get kind of fossilized in their viewpoints. And sometimes they have to retire before new ideas start showing up, or at least new ideas get favored. Here's some of the evolution of those ideas. Dolo is a Belgian, and he just a man on the spot. He was just super lucky. Wrong way. In a coal mine in Belgium, they discovered iguanodon skeletons. Fully articulated, complete iguanodon skeletons. And they didn't find one or two. They found almost 40 fully articulated iguanodon skeletons. This was a gold mine of anatomy now. We could put the whole thing together. And not just one, a mass mortality. And you can go to Brussels and see them. They're in this museum. I worked at this museum for a while. European museums, when you're working in the scientific area, they don't want you looking at the stuff for free. In the American Museum, if I'm working in the scientific area, I can skip out the door at lunch and walk around. And I was finding in European Museum, you have to go through the gate and pay and then go back in. But I did a couple days just to look at these. So that's iguanodon. This is what Mantell thought iguanodon. Remember, Mantell had teeth and a few bones, and he drew it like a lizard. And that's what he thought. He just made a big iguana with a rhino horn. Owens and Hawkins, that's what they did with it, made kind of like a bear, big goofy lizard. That's what Dolo did with it. He said, it's kind of like an alligator. So look at the snout. He didn't put the thing on the snout because he had whole skeletons. Oh, there's Knight's iguanodon, dragging his tail. And that's what we think it looked like today, as a modern reconstruction. But the snout thing, I got ahead of myself. This is what Mantell had. He had this pokey thing, and he put it on the snout. But he had no evidence that it was just a guess. That's where he put it. Dolo had 38 complete skeletons. And that's the old-fashioned view. He had 38 complete skeletons, so you know exactly where that spike went. And there's where it is. It's the thumb. It's a very impressive spike on the hand. Function unknown. But there's one idea. A defensive weapon, maybe for stripping vegetation off plants, but kind of a neat example of as we learn, we make new discoveries, we can modify our ideas. Just an expression on his face. So this fascinates me as well because these are toys. There's the iguanodon from the 60s. That's a British Museum approved model. There's one from the 90s. That's Carnegie. And there's the modern one. So our ideas change. Starting in the late 60s into the 70s, guys, just one more thing here. Yeah, one more quick thing here in history, and then we'll get to dinosaurs. Is something called dinosaur renaissance. As I said a minute ago, we had gone quite a while without new ideas. New discoveries were being made throughout the first 50, 60 years of the 20th century, but not a lot of new ideas. Not that these weren't skilled paleontologists, but they were locked in this old worldview. And as they retired and stopped having tremendous influence on their graduate students, new ideas started to develop, and it's called the dinosaur renaissance. And it goes from this kind of dinosaur, the kind of dinosaur you guys think of when you think of dinosaurs, the Jurassic Park dinosaurs. It does a couple things. It gets the tails off the ground, and it puts feathers on dinosaurs. And it views dinosaurs as active, agile creatures, probably warm-blooded, not dim-witted, slow things. So there's our earliest ideas, these big goofy concrete models. And a little bit more advanced thinking, but still we're dragging our tails. And there's where we are now. So this is a reinterpretation of the anatomy, just applying what we know about modern reptiles and mammals as well to these skeletons. So there's that, ancient. And here's where, these are the same three dinosaurs, those are the big early three, and here's our current conception of them. An early proponent of this, and there he is at the Yale Peabody, is Ostrom. He was making discoveries in Antarctica, and he and his graduate students started rethinking dinosaurs. And what they're thinking, warm-blooded, well, this is two views of the same dinosaur, Deinonychus. They're thinking probably warm-blooded, probably active and agile, and probably feathered. And these are ideas they started to propose in the 60s. And we've confirmed an awful lot of what we've been in animal. We can confirm feathers. We can confirm warm-blooded sometimes. If the bones are preserved correctly, you can tell if they're warm-blooded. So we go from something like this more to something like this. The main proponent of this, and you see him on dinosaur shows occasionally, and he's written popular books on this, is Robert Baker with 2 Ks. And he presents himself with a big shaggy beard and a cowboy hat, kind of digging those dinosaur bones out of the Badlands of Montana. But he's the main proponent of this, the first prominent proponent, put it that way. He wrote the book, The Dinosaur Heresies. And often when there's a big change in our worldview, a lot of the older people are having a hard time with it. So, these are the heresies. And this is where that Jurassic Park modern world comes from. Dinosaurs walked upright with the tail back behind its counterweight. They weren't dragging the tail. A lot of them were probably warm-blooded, at least trending towards warm-bloodedness. They were agile, active creatures, not dragging that tail. And birds are clearly dinosaurs. That's the hardest one for a lot of people. Excuse me. So let's just look at this transition. Old way of thinking, new way of thinking. I mean, it never should have made sense to anybody that tail would have been dragged. There's an old skeleton mount. This is what we used to call Brontosaurus, with that tail going down here. This is the Peabody. And there it's been remounted, the same specimen. There it's been remounted with the tail as a counterweight. This, by the way, the museums started doing this in the 80s, taking their old mounts and redoing this. I think LA County Museum closed for about 2-3 years to do this. It's extremely expensive to rebuild the iron framework to hold the skeleton, and it takes years. So there's Tyrannosaurus. There's our classic view of Tyrannosaur. Any good movie from the 50s shows them like that. And that's our much more modern view. Charles Knight painted them with their mouths shut, which I like. They didn't walk around like this. So there's a Tyrannosaur. This is the Carnegie one. And when I was working at the Carnegie, and when was that? That was 96. That's what it looked like. And now it looks like that. I haven't seen it like that. Anyone follow the Pittsburgh Steelers? Their fans wave a yellow cloth around called a terrible towel. During football season, that skeleton's holding a terrible towel. So there's the toys again. There's the 60s version, 60s, 70s version. There's a slightly more modern version. There's a current one. It's hard to mold a toy that can balance itself so the tail has to curve down as a counterbalance. But there you go. The other thing we went to is feathers. And Velociraptor, that's an agile Velociraptor, so that's, we're that far along. Agile, active carnivore. But Velociraptor was feathered. And more looks like that, kind of like an ostrich instead of a scary dinosaur. And not everybody was happy with this. So, I'm going to read that. That's just a cute person. Any questions?